Everyone, I think we're going to get started. So on behalf of the International Development Program here at SAIS, I would like to welcome all of you to today's event with Mr. Ross Baird. My name is Chloe Howenstein, and I am this year's coordinator for the International Development Roundtable series. The Development Roundtable is a high-profile speaker series where leaders and practitioners within the international development realm address our students, faculty, and the broader community on trends and challenges that are shaping the field. I am very happy to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Ross Baird. Mr. Baird is the founder and CEO of Village Capital, a unique investing firm that finds, supports, and invests in entrepreneurs solving real-world problems globally. Since 2009, Village Capital has supported over 600 ventures worldwide through its peer review model. To date, Village Capital entrepreneurs have created over 11,000 jobs and served over 5 million customers. Before launching Village Capital, Mr. Baird worked with First Light Ventures, a seed fund focused on impact investments. Prior to First Light, Mr. Baird worked on the development of 4 education-related startup ventures, the Indian School Finance Company in Hyderabad, India, the National College Advising Corps in Chapel Hill, and 2 ventures using technology to promote civic participation. He has a Master of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and a BA from the University of Virginia. He teaches courses in entrepreneurship and impact investing at the University of Virginia. His new book, The Innovation Blind Spot, which was released in September, discusses why social innovations often go unnoticed by investors and how we can change that. Given the ever-increasing importance of impact investing, and I know that many SAIS students are very interested in it, I'm really looking forward to hearing Mr. Baird's insights today. So now please help me welcome Mr. Ross Baird.
Thank you, Chloe. Thanks for organizing this. All right, how's everyone doing?
Great.
Awesome. Does this? No, it's right here. It's much more obvious than I thought it was. I had a clicker blind spot. So I would love to, before kicking off, just get a sense of who's in the room. You're all very busy students and professionals, and presumably you have a lot of good things to do with your time. So we have probably 30 minutes? So in the next half hour, with all the different things you could be doing, what do you want to get out of our time together? I have some things that I can start with, but I want to get a sense of who you are and why are you here? What do you want to get out of our time? Just love to hear from a couple different people. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm a social entrepreneur who is also working on a startup, and I think what would be cool is to learn how to be pitched to investors so that we can avoid that blind spot. And
Okay.
Make it, exciting, and also when do we show the social aspect before or after?
Okay, great. Yes.
Pros and cons of privatization of public services, particularly like you in India, maybe the school system, and sometimes the private sector does it better, or maybe doesn't. So what are your take on some of those things and some of the problems that
Sure.
people need to know?
Great. Yeah.
So I think one would think when you're making an impact investment, there would be a trade-off between the profit and value. Is that necessarily true, or you could do it without trade-off?
Trade-off between profit and value. Okay. Maybe one more, just to grease the wheels here. Good thoughts. Yes?
I would like to hear more about what the peer-to-peer funds look like.
Okay.
And how are they choosing, their own competition?
All right. Excellent. Well, I am going to cover all of that and more. What I want to do is run through some ideas. We'll take some more questions. I'll try and speak to these thoughts in the presentation as well. I wrote a book called The Innovation Blind Spot, which I'll talk about. If you like what you hear, we'll have books for sale. We got a kind of at cost, no markup, no royalty price for all of you. So you can take one. You can pay by PayPal, I think, is the best way. If you dislike what I say, you can buy a book and give it to an enemy. But still buy a book. And so the books are over there. If you like it or hate it, there's more to go. If you are talking on social media, if you have your phone out, I'll assume it's because you're trying to share the brilliance of the conversation with the rest of the world and not talking to your friends about other things. These are different things you could talk about on social media and share the conversation with people more broadly. So let's get started. So I think any organization, whether you're starting a business, whether you're starting an investment fund, it's whether you're a politician and you've got a great policy idea, any organization, any idea is going to fail if you're not specific about what the problem it is you're trying to solve. Albert Einstein once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes identifying what the problem was and then spend 5 minutes solving it, something like that. And what I have found is I founded a firm, Village Capital. We invest in entrepreneurs. I've probably worked with 1,000 entrepreneurs over the last decade. We have a fund that's invested in probably 100. And the businesses that are the most successful getting customers, hiring great people, raising money are specific to the point of annoying about the problem that they're solving. And very often you hear a business saying, this is specifically what you're doing. You're like, oh, that's very, very small. But the best businesses and the best ideas are very often the most focused. And so, I wrote this book, The Innovation Blind Spot. There was a quote that I found while I was writing the book from Shelby Foote, who's a Civil War historian. And Shelby Foote is the most famous Civil War historian who lived. And he didn't set out to be a Civil War historian. He told this story about how he grew up in Mississippi, and he said, I've spent my career learning about the Civil War, and the biggest thing I've learned is that Southerners are real funny about that war. And so, and you can see in the headlines, for many people, the Civil War is still happening. And Shelby Foote dug into why the Civil War mattered so much in Mississippi. And through that, he wrote the great tome of the Civil War. And he said, you don't write a book because you think you've got something to say. You write a book because you want to find out the answer to something, and you want to share the journey with other people. And I wrote the book, The Innovation Blind Spot, because the very specific problem that my team, where's Rachel? Rachel's probably setting up the books out there. My team and I are solving a very specific problem that I'm going to describe in a second. It's a problem I call the 0 for 3 problem. And in trying to figure out why the 0 for 3 problem was such a problem, I recognized that there were a lot of stories of people that I've worked with, including some people in this room and people that I didn't know that were trying to solve the same problem, and it had come up with some really exciting and interesting results. So what is the problem that Village Capital, the firm I started, and actually a lot of people in this room are trying to solve? It's what I call the 0 for 3 problem. We at Village Capital back entrepreneurs, and this is a guy named Jerry Namorin. Jerry was born in Haiti. His family in the 91 revolution fled as political refugees, and they settled in South Florida. Jerry's mom spoke very little English. Jerry, with an 11-year-old's understanding of math, could see his mom getting systematically ripped off by payday lenders and check cashers, and he would run the numbers on the interest that she was being charged. He's like, Mom, why are you taking that? And she said, Jerry, we don't really have a choice. Like, I know we're getting ripped off, but there's nothing else we can do. So Jerry says he's going to dedicate his career to helping people like his mom get fair financial services. So Jerry goes to Wall Street. He goes to University of Florida first in his family go to college. He graduates and goes to Wall Street and learns about, from Bank of America's perspective, where he worked, how big banks treat the finances of lower and middle class people. And the answer he got was not very great for people like his mom. But he did find, he saw over and over again, rich people could resettle their debts pretty quickly. Like, you can buy off your medical debt or your student debt or whatever. If you're able to pay cash, you can buy off your debts for 15, 20 cents on the dollar. And Jerry said, this is great. Why can't poor people do this? So he says, I'm going to start this company called Lend Street, and what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate a bunch of debts from poor people, and we're going to raise money, and we're going to refinance the medical debt of people like my mom or whatever it is. Goes to University of Virginia in Charlottesville, business school, says, this is what we're going to do. It's a great company. talks to 300 people over about 2 years, going to one of the top business schools in the world, doesn't raise any money. I met Jerry when he was kind of at the end of the line. He had been fundraising for a while, and he wanted to give up. He said, I know it's the right solution, but I just can't figure out how to finance this company. I said, Jerry, what's the deal? Like, where are you struggling? He goes, venture capitalists, investors are all about pattern recognition. Let me break it down for you. I'm a black guy. I live in Central Virginia, and I'm solving poor people's problems. In the finance world, I'm 0 for 3. And if you look at where capital goes, when we think about new ideas, we look at where money goes in a big picture, Jerry being a black guy, who you are, a lot of people are cut out of the financing world. These are global numbers. Women raise less than 10% of financing. People of color, and this includes African American Latinos in the US, it includes in-country entrepreneurs in emerging markets, raise less than 1% of financing globally. This is Chris Sacca, who's a famous angel investor from Shark Tank, if you've seen the show. If you go to Chris Sacca's website and want Chris Sacca to invest money, and you actually just retired as an angel investor, but for a long time, he wrote on his website, and a lot of investors say this, we invest in our networks. We invest in people we know and understand. Now, most people, like Jerry, don't have any friends who have a lot of money. So it's very, very difficult, depending on who you are, to get access to financing. The second blind spot, I'd say, has a lot to do with where you are. So Jerry in Central Virginia, in the 80% of startup investment in the US and 50% of startup investment in the world goes to 3 US states. They're the ones here on this map. If you're in Central Virginia, you're kind of out of luck. You might think that we are in a golden age of innovation if you look at all the articles of Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera. But firm creation in the US specifically, and I'll talk about emerging markets in a second, but entrepreneurial activity in the US is actually at a 40-year low. This yellow line is firms starting. This black line is firms dying. Basically, businesses are shutting at the rate they have for the last 40 years, but fewer and fewer firms, even post-Great Recession, are starting in the U.S. And I think it's because a lot of capital is concentrated in a lot of places. So if you look at these 3 states, firm creation has actually gone up 300% in the last 15 years. But in the rest of the country, it's declined, and we're seeing a lot of similar trends in emerging markets too. Final thing, Jerry talks about his business solving poor people's problems. So if you look at the 6 industries that make up the majority of consumer spending, these are industries like financial services, education, health. It's about 80% of consumer spending. It's only 15% of the billion-dollar companies that have been created by the venture capital industry are in these industries. People are overwhelmingly investing in things like the $600 juicer, Juicero, which raised $120 million to give you $8 per glass cold-pressed juices. And Bloomberg actually found that you could squeeze these juice bags by hand and you didn't even need the $600 machine. So then the business went bust, $120 million. But, we see thousands of entrepreneurs in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and they can't raise $25,000 to get their business off the ground. So there's a huge imbalance of the types of problems our financial markets are trying to solve. So not surprisingly, global inequality is actually at an 80-year high. So what is the cause of this? You asked a question around trade-offs. And I think the cause of this third blind spot of, why are the industries that are the most important for the real world ones that people are not investing in? When I started Village Capital, I said we want to invest in businesses that are doing good things for the world and things like health and education, and also trying to be financially successful. Private sector solutions to societal problems. And this one guy, very successful entrepreneur, lived in Atlanta where I was at the time, said, young man, this is a very interesting idea, but I got 2 pockets. With one pocket, I make as much money as I can. With the other pocket, once I got enough, I give it all away. And despite, there are these philosophical questions, like this guy was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So despite the philosophical questions like how much is enough and all of that, you could say, he would say, are you asking me for my do-gooder money? Like, why are you asking for an investment? To give you a grant. If you're asking me for an investment, why are you talking about all these like wonderful societal things? It just doesn't make sense to me. I think society cognitively thinks this way. Either it's to help people, in which case nonprofits and government do it, or it's to make money, in which case business does it. But if business makes money, they don't have any obligation to help people, and nonprofits and government don't have any obligation to pay attention to the resources that you're using. We've done this for a very long time. The problem, and going back to where inequality is, the problem is if you add up the value of all of the public companies in just the US, what do you think it is? Just a guess. Give me a number. Public companies in the US, market cap. About 220 trillion. So add another zero and you're there. Add up the value of all of the charitable foundations in the world. Gates, Ford. Soros, Coke. It's about 1 trillion. Add up the value of all of the foreign aid budgets in the world. It's about 20 trillion. So adding up the government spending on do-gooder things and the private sector spending, it's about 10% of the value of all just the public companies. And this doesn't include very large privately held companies. So if you say business takes care of this pocket and society takes care of this pocket and they balance out, they don't. Business has at least, and these are just the businesses we know about, 10 times the resources of the people who are left to do good. So what we've got is a society where business is creating a lot of problems and there's just not enough resources to clean them up. So there's an error processing this page, and it's okay. So that's the 0 for 3 problem. How I got it's okay. We can riff from here. Okay, that's fine. So how I got here was I've always been an entrepreneur, and I tell this story in the book. But I started when I was in college. I went to the University of Virginia, not far from here, and I started a company that essentially was working in civic education. And I originally set it up as a nonprofit. And I pitched this guy we needed $10,000. And I pitched this guy who I knew through kind of my social network. So I'm in the 91% of startup financing that goes to white guys. Nothing against white guys, but white guys tend to have an easier time raising money. I pitched another white guy, and he said, "This is a great idea." It was an education idea. He's like, "This is a great idea. I do your $10,000." But I actually had some. It was a platform that taught kids about civics, and I actually had some advertising revenue come in. He goes, "But I wouldn't do a grant. I'd do a bridge loan, or I'd do an investment." I said, "That sounds awesome. I'll take it. What's a bridge loan?" And he took a step back and he said, "If you set this up, if I take a grant, you'll take my money and do your thing. But if I make an investment in you and you get me my $10,000 back, then I can go and invest in other people like you, and it'll be a much more sustainable way to grow. Other people like you could benefit from this money." And that was the first time I had ever thought of merging two pockets into one. Like, why would you do this education thing that actually had a business proposition? But it made a lot of sense to me. And as I went through to my career, I went to graduate school. And for those of you who are SCICE students, when I was in graduate school, I was choosing between going to a very large consulting firm or going to go work for a startup in India that was a microfinance bank for schools. And the consulting firm paid about 20 times what the startup job paid. And there were all kinds of things going on there. But I ended up going to India. I lived in Hyderabad, and I worked for this startup called the Indian School Finance Company, which made loans to small schools, largely in slum areas in India. About 30 million kids go to schools that charge about $1, $2 a week. And I had been very interested in education policy. And to your question, I had never really thought about the idea of private schools working for the poor. Like, when would you do it? Why would you do it? Et cetera. In Hyderabad, the reason why there were so many of these schools was Hyderabad's school system was built for a city of about 500,000. So India has a tech boom. Hyderabad is now a city of 5 million. They grew 10 times in about 15 years. Even if the government were the best school builder possible, they just didn't have, they had the infrastructure for 500,000 people, and there were 5 million kids. And a lot of these people were working for Accenture and Ernst & Young and sending them to very expensive private schools. But all these people were janitors' kids, and they didn't really have a school to go to. So this whole industry of schools that developed to meet an organic need was really interesting. And some of these schools were really bad, and some of these schools were really good. And the really good schools, the parents knew which schools were good. They could see who was performing. And some of the schools that were very good, they wanted to add classrooms. Or we'd go to these buildings, and the school would be like an abandoned bakery the size of this room, and there would be tarps in between grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and these schools said we'd like to build walls, and no one was financing them. So this microfinance bank evolved to make loans to schools at fair interest rates, and it was really, really incredible. And this was right in the middle of the growth of the microfinance industry, which is probably one of the most interesting solutions to the 0 for 3 problem we've seen in financial services. So today there are $30 billion that are invested globally in the microfinance industry, which I'm guessing this crowd's pretty familiar with. There's a 99+% repayment rate. Microfinance does not solve poverty or cure everything, but it does help cash flow management a lot with very poor families. And the reason why microfinance was able to reach where banks hadn't reached before is not because it was anything new. Loans have been around forever. It's because people thought differently about how they innovate. And that's one of the biggest things I've learned. When we think about innovation, we think, what's the next big thing? Machine learning, AI, automation. What's the next hot technology? Process innovations and structure innovations are seriously underrated. And what the difference was in microfinance was people made loans through not pitching a loan officer like you would with a traditional bank, but through peer review. The village bank idea in microfinance was you'd have a village of people, and you'd have people that were eligible for a loan, and you would evaluate your peer group. And the women in the village largely would determine who was eligible for a loan. And changing who made the decisions, having the decision over the loan happen at the village level and not in New York or Geneva or Zurich or San Francisco, completely transformed what this product could be. So I worked for this company for a couple of years. I observed a lot of this industry solving a very specific subset of the 0 for 3 problem. And then I went back to the US and I worked for a firm called Gray Ghost Ventures, which was an impact investment firm making startup investments in companies around the world. And I said, we're here in Atlanta, and we are largely investing in white guys who live in San Francisco and London and whatever. And if we want to solve for this larger problem, we need to think differently about how we invest. And so the name Village Capital comes from the Village Bank idea in microfinance. The way that we invest is we source entrepreneurs. We build a community of entrepreneurs in a sector like health or financial inclusion. The entrepreneurs themselves make investment decisions. And I'm just going to blow up the presentation here. And this is just our experience, but by changing the way we invest. So we have, women in Nairobi who are building financial services software for farmers, make investment decisions over men in Nanyuki who are making supply chain management software for people growing flowers and trying to export them. And the entrepreneurs who are closest to the problem are making investment decisions. that is not the solution to the entire 0 for 3 problem, but changing where we find ideas and changing how we make decisions in a more localized and contextualized way has given us a very different portfolio. So 90% of our investments are in people who don't live in Massachusetts, New York, and California. Across the financial services industry, it's about 20%. 43% of our investments are in women founders. It's about 5% otherwise. About 25% of our investments are in people of color. It's about 1% in general financial services. You see in sub-Saharan Africa, 91% of investments made in companies are in expat-founded companies. Africans starting a company in Africa raise 99% of the money. In our portfolio, it's 90% of our investments are in Africans growing African companies. If you change the process by which you innovate, that's starting to be an example of some of the results that you get. So I could go on and on and on, but I will probably stop here to see if there are questions, thoughts, things you want to talk about. I think the bottom line is, if you're trying to solve problems, whether they're government problems, whether they're private sector problems, whether they're somewhere in between, very often the person who has the idea to solve the problem is out there. And very often their voice is not in the conversation. Very often they have no power to allocate resources. And if you change how you find ideas, change how you allocate resources, you'll get better and more inclusive solutions. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions, but thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it. I might start with your question because I didn't quite answer it, but I did talk about schools in India. So when do you see the private sector versus the public sector solving a problem? And I think, in the book, I tell the story of probably the most successful innovation we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa is the development of mobile money. And I tell this story in the book, but the founder of M-Pesa is this guy, Nick Hughes, who grew up in working class North England. And he was working for CGAP on a development project. He was working for Vodafone, and Vodafone and CGAP had this partnership, and they say, we're going to go around, we're going to sign people up for bank accounts. And he was walking through the slums of Dar es Salaam, and he realized people didn't want bank accounts. They didn't have any money. But people were doing something very curious, which is Vodafone had a deal where you could redeem at any kiosk your Vodafone prepaid card for cash or the other way around. And people were buying cards, mailing them to their families in rural areas, and their families were going to whatever kiosk and turning in their card to cash. People were doing this because it was cheaper than Western Union. And so he went back to Vodafone and he said, people don't actually want bank accounts, but people do want to send money. We should help people send money. And they said, I don't know. And so he kind of developed this thing as its own idea. DFID, the British Development Agency, put in $1 million. Vodafone matched it with $1 million. Then it became a Vodafone project. That's now M-Pesa, where 70% of all transactions in the East African bloc happen mobile to mobile. And Safaricom is the most dominant player, mainly because they have the M-Pesa platform. If they set out, I think a lot of people come private sector, come with a solution, and they look for a problem. So rich people have bank accounts, poor people don't. Let's sign everyone up for a bank account. And that almost never works. Private sector solutions, I think, tend to work if they play into the contextual behavior of what people were doing. The reason why M-Pesa worked was not because it was a great idea, it was because it required very little behavior change for people to understand it, because they had already kind of started figuring out how to do it. With schools, the Indian School Finance Company actually just raised a very large amount of finance from mainstream banks, and they have great financials, they have a great balance sheet, they're doing really, really well. Around the same time as the Indian School Finance Company, another company started in Africa called Bridge International Academies. And Bridge has raised $100 million from Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, famous tech people. And what the Indian School Finance Company, what we did was we looked for principals who were already running schools, already had met some level of criteria, had some enrollment numbers, meaning communities bought in, and we're looking for growth capital. What Bridge did is they said, we are going to start a chain of schools that we're going to control everything and we're going to control the curriculum and everything. And in Silicon Valley mentality, Bridge didn't think it was important for their teachers to have licenses. In Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, you have to be a licensed teacher. They said, this is corrupt, this is bureaucracy, we can disrupt the whole thing. So they started hiring unlicensed teachers. And what ended up happening was the communities, everybody in every Ugandan village knew somebody who was a licensed teacher. And the teachers' unions got very mad at Bridge because they said they're not hiring any unionized teachers, they're only hiring unlicensed teachers. So finally, politicians moved to shut down Bridge in Uganda, and Bridge does a PR campaign talking about all the great results that they have. And the people said, we don't care. You know, my neighbor doesn't like Bridge. I've never heard of you. I don't know you. And so they shut down the schools with pretty broad public support. So Bridge has raised $100 million and is financially doing really, really poorly. And the Indian School Finance Company raised $10 million and is continuing to grow steadily. And the big difference, and we talked about at the very beginning, do we do what Bridge is doing or do we do it differently? The big difference is every school that the Indian School Finance Company, the Indian School Finance Company now has 4 spinoffs that all have about more than $100 million worth of value. All of these companies invest in principals who are local, who have started their own schools, who are building their own thing. Whereas Bridge said, we're going to do a chain that's kind of like centrally controlled by its own software. So there's a kind of a top-down versus bottom-up thing where I see if a solution is organically developing to fill a need that the private sector can do better or faster or just there, and the community has buy-in, it tends to go well. I know I'm dramatically oversimplifying very complicated issues. If the private sector says, this is great, everybody uses education, it's $1 trillion market, we can build a business out of it, and that decision is made very far away from the people, it tends to go very poorly. That's kind of my, I know that's dramatically oversimplifying a complicated issue.
Did you monetize any of these school guys? When you say you have $100 million tranche or something in all these different places, would they ever go public? I mean, I'm just.
So those are all loans.
All loans.
Those are all loans to schools. So we did not.
They're not for profit, but they're for profit.
Some of the schools are for profit, some are not for profit. It all depends on the principal. So like some principals would say, I'm going to start this little for-profit school, and and some people set up not for profits, but still took on loans. But we didn't have a point of view on whether nonprofit or for-profit was better. We looked at the underlying fundamentals of the school. Other questions? Yeah.
Just to follow up on that question, and thanks for being here. Do you then make a decision only based on the financial side of it, or do you also look at the kind of impact that the school is having? And if so, how do you measure that kind of?
So at the Indian School Finance Company, we actually used student results as part of the investment decision. And this gets back to like the trade-offs, the either or. A lot of people would say, and you look at like the University of Phoenix, for example, doing very well financially, very poor data on actually helping students get jobs. A lot of people would say, well, there's got to be some trade-off between good school quality and financial success, and how do you balance that? And for us, we had minimum requirements of student success, and we looked at test scores, we looked at higher education placement, we looked at job placement, like wherever the student wanted to go. And it was because over the long term, you know, if you're running the Indian School Finance Company, you make a $5,000 loan to a school, they repay it at an 8% interest rate. Like, you're only going to build a long-term profitable business if that school keeps growing and continues to want more capital to do more things. Like, your long-term repeat customers are what makes the company successful. And we figured over the short term, you could run a profitable school with bad results, but these parents are putting 20% of their income into one kid's tuition. And these parents are some of the most demanding customers out there in a great way. And like the schools that don't deliver do great for 2 or 3 years, and the parents are like, screw it. My neighbor's kid got into the local community college, and my kid didn't, so my next kid's going to go where my neighbor's kid. Like the movement of children follows test scores and job placement and university placement. So we thought it would only, so for us, the educational outcomes of the school were actually tied to whether this was going to be a profitable long-term customer. And so it was really, really important to us. And I think one of the things that I think is a risk with impact investment broadly is getting in this trade-off mentality, because odds, if you say, well, we're going to be slightly concessionary, but we're going to have a really great impact, then if you have a bad quarter or you have a hurricane come through, or if there's an emergency, people tend to cut the impact if it's seen as unprofitable, but something that we do just because. The only impact investments I've seen which are successful over the long term are the ones where they say the impact we're doing actually is a core part of the business case. Yes, ma'am.
So, thank you very interesting talk. The Indian School Finance Company, how were they financed? Where did they raise their money from? What was their relationship with the banking sector? And the reason I ask this question is I come from West Africa, Sierra, and a big challenge that we have, especially in renewables, is that the finance sector, which is not, I worked here a long time ago trying to raise finance for new technologies in the US. The finance sector is not touching any of it, the banks.
Right.
A regular bank is not interested, don't know how it works, not financing it. So it's a big problem for local business trying to raise money, especially working capital. Just
Right.
And so does the Indian School Finance Company model start to solve that kind of intermediary problem?
So what was interesting about the Indian School Finance Company is they raised private capital. They raised, I don't know the number, but it was in the millions of private capital from investors, largely foreign investors who were interested in solving this problem. But the schools, their customers, didn't trust. They trusted a bank. And the Indian School Finance Company, when they started, was this startup weird finance company, and people didn't want to take money from that. So what the Indian School Finance Company did is they essentially bought an Indian bank with part of what they did. It was a regulated bank. It was dormant. It hadn't been used in 20 years, and they bought it for $250,000 or something. And when they said, we are here to help you grow, people didn't really understand what they did. When they said, we are a bank that lends to schools, people were like, oh, I get that. I know what a bank is. And so the CEO, his name is David Kyle. He actually teaches here at SAIS. We had a naming discussion, and everyone came up with all these creative names like Dream and Aspire and all of that. And he said, no, people need the name to say what we do. Indian School Finance Company. Every time you walk door to door, people say, oh, I know what you do. Do you finance schools? Yeah, so it was really, really important. The innovation was not in what we did. We were a bank that lent to schools. The innovation was in how we used, for example, student test scores as part of the loan underwriting. So I think.
Well, I would disagree with you that the innovation is not like your bank. You have to find a way to bridge the disconnect between the needs you were trying to serve and the idea that they were comfortable with banks.
That's true. That's true. And after we bought a bank, it was a much more straightforward value proposition because people knew what a bank was. So. Yes.
Would you be able to, and I'm trying to simplify that, would you be able to differentiate the three categories, the for-profit, the do-gooder types of investments, and we're talking about two pockets, or the merge of the two. Would you be able to differentiate the criteria each of them look for in a project? So you have this same project. What would the first one be looking for, and the second one be looking for, and the third one?
So the business pocket would say, how much money am I going to make? The do-gooder project would say, what is the impact that you're going to have? And the one-pocket idea would say, what is the impact you're going to have, and how does that impact specifically help you make more money? And there's a reason why most people are two-pocket thinkers. Combining both of those ideas into one is more complicated, and it's a complicated world already. But I would argue that if you're only thinking about how, there's a quote that I had, they said, goodness without knowledge is weak and feeble, and knowledge without goodness is dangerous. If you're only thinking about how much money you can make, you get into very dangerous ethical territory very quickly. I was talking to a large business school in Cambridge, Massachusetts about this topic, and one of the students said it's financially irresponsible to not, no, they said it's ethically irresponsible for a company to not pursue the most profitable option out there. And I said, well, are you in prostitution? And he said, of course not. And I said, well, what if I told you that prostitution is a really very lucrative industry? He's like, well, of course I wouldn't do that. And I said, well, you just said it was ethically, like there are philosophical limits to this just like maximizing value of the firm. And then also we see it over and over again on the nonprofit or on the philanthropic side. The lack of financial sustainability absolutely crushes the development sector. And I think that philanthropy is right for lots of things. I think that there are some people who are fundamentalist about this and says business can solve every problem at all times. That's certainly not true. And the vast majority of schools that we lent to at the Indian School Finance Company were themselves nonprofits. And I think that's great. But there are certain things where business can play a role that is much more financially sustainable. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but if you, I guess what I'd say bottom line is if you do artificially separate the two, you should be in the prostitution business and set up a very large foundation. Yes.
I actually wanted to ask a little bit about the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to ask about the numbers. So a little bit into how Village Capital has gone sort of beyond the traditional investment circle that you mentioned earlier, and how Village Capital is relating that back to the industry, or if that's even in the scope of your theory of change currently.
Yeah. Is there a specific example that you're interested in, or?
No, I mean, I think you started with the example of treating the 0 for 3 problem, right? But just sort of generally speaking, how you found the 90% of your portfolio that are outside these hubs, and how you really kind of pushed the portfolio.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. I think one thing, this relates to a conversation that we had right before this. The guy on the left is my grandfather. He took over a college team in the South called Duke University in the late 50s when they were terrible at basketball. Duke is now very good at basketball. My grandfather, his name is Vic Bubis. He was part of that renaissance. So he, in the late 50s, college sports largely recruited how venture capitalists invest today. Coaches would just go to the nearby high schools and get the best people to come play for them. My grandfather was at Duke. Duke was a horrible Southern liberal arts school, and his two competitors were UNC and NC State, which were perennial Final Four teams with Hall of Fame coaches in basketball. And he said, I'm not going to beat them by finding the best kids in North Carolina. So he was, for example, one of the first Southern coaches to recruit African Americans. And he did that because he said, we are largely ignoring a large portion of the population that could be really good. One of his first All-Americans was from Billings, Montana. He looked at states where there were no good basketball programs, and he would send letters to the best basketball players. He got the Duke Library to order magazines and newspapers from like Billings and Colorado Springs, and he would write these kids who were scoring 40 points a game saying, come to Duke. And he was the first coach to use video. And now we invest billions in football, in basketball, in recruiting. And if you're a kid today, this whole like recruiting industrial complex, like we invest so much that there are scandals, that there's too much money in recruiting. But if you're a kid and you grow up in what? It's my grandfather's fault. Yeah. But if you grow up and you're in West Baltimore or you live in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota and you could be a pro football or a basketball player, Mike Krzyzewski, the head coach of Duke, probably knows about you when you're 12 years old. And we have a very clear talent pipeline, and we invest a lot of time and money into it. When we care about solving the 0 for 3 problem, venture capitalists and investors and even people in development finance agencies say, yeah, I totally agree. And I say, well, where do you get your new investment opportunities? And people say, oh, we go to conferences, or we source from our networks, or they'll list things. It's basically like, I find my deals from other people like me in London and DC and San Francisco. And it is really, really expensive to get people on the ground sourcing companies. And I tell this story in our fund, this is an example of where the private and public sector can work together. We have a partnership with USAID in our fund where we have people like doing the equivalent of knocking on doors, finding people who might be entrepreneurs wherever we go. And it's far more expensive than investors are willing to pay for. The average investment fund has 2% management fees. That's how the business model works. And if you're trying to source at a very deep level, just run the numbers. It's really hard to do that if you have an $18 million fund and your budget is 2% of that. So I talked to USAID and our team said, listen, we want to invest in Africans in Africa. And the reason why people don't is these funds are very expensive to run. And they give us a grant of probably $500,000 a year just to do sourcing of companies in areas that are maybe less well developed. And it's the equivalent of Nike putting money into high school basketball camps so this talent pipeline goes. But it's very, very difficult to change these numbers just by saying, we're going to start a new fund that invests in women. You have to invest real time and you have to invest real money in developing the pipeline. And that is something that the private sector has largely been, in my experience, unwilling to pay for, but that is a great role for government or philanthropy to kind of build infrastructure that doesn't exist. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ross. I had a question about your thoughts on, it's more of a, I guess, like a macro level question on the impact investment sector globally. So you mentioned earlier that there's $200 trillion that's locked up in strictly private sector entities. And I think one conclusion could be if even a fraction of that was freed up and started moving into the other pocket, so to speak, you could see massive impact. And I would imagine that's maybe to some degree slowly happening as new players are entering the space. So aside from new sources of capital coming in, are there any large gaps that you see in the impact investment sector that may not necessarily be the straightforward financial gaps, but maybe ones more along the lines of general awareness or talent access, other resources that you think are critical for the success of the sector but have not found their way into yet?
Yeah, so I think talent is a huge one. I think that the biggest gap at a macro level I see, if you want to go really, really macro, the biggest gap is that $220 trillion, there is a huge absentee ownership problem. Nobody knows who owns that $220 trillion. And it's largely owned by actually algorithmic high-frequency traders that sit within hedge funds and investment banks on Wall Street. And those traders, and some of them are manual, some of them are algorithmic, but people who are, like companies are largely managed to maximize quarterly earnings. And right now, the people who are on those earnings calls and pushing CEOs to do this and not that know how to price profit and loss. They don't know how to price the effect of positive or negative social impact on what they do. And so if I were to say, I don't know, if I were a hedge fund billionaire, which I am not, I do not have the money to make this wish possible, but if someone's listening and does, I think that there are, for example, I was talking with I did a book event in New York, and I was talking with the head of investments for AIG, one of the largest investors in the world. This guy manages almost $1 trillion. They own insurance policies in lots of very expensive coastal cities on property. And I said, what are you guys doing about climate change? And he was like, what do you mean? And I said, well, you're going to be spending a lot of AIG's real money in Miami over the next 30 years. A lot of it. like lots of billions of dollars. And it may be a good idea, because you're investing a couple $100 billion a year, it may be a good idea to try and think about things you could invest in that might mitigate the effects of climate change, not because it's like a great corporate citizen thing you can announce, but because it'll save you money on the other side. And he's like, oh, that's a really interesting idea. It was like, how have you never thought of this before? But it's this two-pocket mentality. He was like, yeah, our CEO made this Davos announcement that we're like one of the Fortune 500 who's like standing up to climate change. Like, what does that mean? Like, until your trading algorithm like is measured to the insurance policies you hold, it's insane. So I would say, but there, we have quants working on insane things like creating the entire subprime mortgage industry. Like, we have financial innovation ruining the world, and we have the intellectual horsepower to be able to do this, and I think that's not sexy but really critical. Pricing social and environmental risk is the shorthand for that. Maybe is that as macro as you wanted to go? Okay, great. Maybe time for one more question or two more. Make it quick, you guys.
I'll try to be as quick as possible. I'm an MIEF student here, so I've got more of the economic and finance, more of the private sector side,
Yeah.
which is not to say that I don't completely agree with pretty much everything you've said here today. But my background comes from the institutional investing side, the AIG types
Yeah.
of the world. And I know that they do consider this in a way, but as an investor, they're looking at something that fits into their portfolio theory. They're looking for risk and return. And obviously with externalities priced, it's a very attractive prospect, but without externalities priced, how do you access that 220 trillion that otherwise is seeking strictly a profit motive?
I don't think you can. I think that we've seen a lot in environmental, social governance, ESG, like investing with some kind of a social screen. I think goodwill and PR and like what people want from their companies is largely driving that. I think that painkillers sell a lot better than vitamins do. And right now, a lot of the macro investment stuff I've seen is very vitamin. It's great. And AIG announces our environmental investment portfolio, which is like less than 1% of the portfolio. And not to pick on AIG, they're actually like trying to think about this. But until people very clearly see, listen, if I do not invest in climate stuff today, AIG will lose billions 20 years from now. I don't actually see meaningful change. But the good news, there are a lot of people who want to work on that, and we just need to keep things moving in the right direction. Last question.
So I wanted to build off of the previous question a little bit, where you're talking about pricing social and environmental risk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about when the investment itself sort of imposes that social and environmental risk. For example, when land acquisition in an area inhabited by indigenous peoples causes relocation, instability, and often project failure, is there ways that you recommend like implementing mitigation strategies to capture those risks early on and to ensure that communities have access to remedy when things go wrong?
Yeah, a lot of the work to be done in impact investing is exactly this. There's a lot of technical modeling. I think that impact investing has done to date a relatively poor job of making the business case for things like you're talking about. Like, I would argue that 10 years ago, Bridge Academies looked like a much better investment than the Indian School Finance Company, because they raised $100 million and Mark Zuckerberg was invested in, and it's created by Silicon Valley people. How can this go wrong? And the Indian School Finance Company was this tiny little startup that no one ever heard of in Hyderabad. But you would say, listen, one of these things has community buy-in and the other is like actively making the community angry and they don't care. Like, there's got to be some way to build that into the risk profile of the investment. Today, I would much rather have my money in these 5 spin-offs in India than the one company in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, because of how this kind of community buy-in and lack of community buy-in has played out. That's the single biggest determining factor. So if you say, look, and these are how finance people think. Like, look, this is something we're going to do up front. You think it might be more expensive, you think it might be slower growth, but like here is a risk modeling, and here is why investing, you know, $150,000 in doing this now might save you a $10 million loss later or whatever. I mean, this kind of financial modeling is something that is not my skill set. I have team members who are in that. But if you are interested in impact investing and you're in Cinnamon's like finance and accounting track, there are very, very few people actually building models and case studies and things like that. So that's one of, if you're really excited about these ideas, you're like, this is great, what's next? This is one of the bigger underexplored, like making the financial case that this type of inclusive growth is going to be more long-term successful. So yeah, I mean, short answer is you're going to need to make that case to people with capital, but you could, and other people have, and the data is also out there. All right, I am going to stick around probably for another 10 minutes or so. If you want a book, I'm going to sign some books over there. And otherwise, thank you so much for your time. This has been really, really great.
Thank you.